What are the creepiest government conspiracies? Story 1 in 1973, as the Watergate scandal was threatening to expand its reach into the intelligence community, CIA Director James Schlesinger sent a memo to every CIA employee instructing them to report to him any activities that might be outside the legislative charter of the agency. He was, in effect, asking the CIA to confess to itself. The resulting document, known internally as the Family Jewels, ran to approximately 693 pages. It described surveillance of American journalists. It described assassination plots against foreign leaders. It described domestic mail opening programs. It described testing of behavior-altering substances on unwitting American citizens. It described infiltration of domestic political organizations. It described break-ins. It described the creation of front organizations operating inside the United States. It described the agency's involvement in activities that its own charter explicitly prohibited, and that in several cases were straightforwardly illegal under U.S. law. The document was shared with CIA leadership. It was not shared with Congress. It was not disclosed to the public. It was classified and stored. Schlesinger's successor as CIA Director, William Colby, eventually shared portions of it with the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, which led to the 1975 Church Committee and Pike Committee investigations. The full document was released to the public in 2007, 34 years after it was compiled. By that point, most of the people who had committed the acts described in it had died. No prosecutions had resulted from the document's contents. The specific character of the Family Jewels as an object is what makes it memorable. A government agency writing down everything it knew it had done wrong, then classifying the confession. Not destroying the evidence, classifying it, filing it, as if they expected to need it someday. Story 2 in 1969. President Nixon issued an executive order requiring the destruction of all U.S. biological weapons stockpiles. The order was serious, it was public, and it was the United States officially stepping back from the biological warfare program it had been running for decades. The CIA didn't comply. MK Naomi was a joint CIA-Army program that had accumulated at Fort Detrick in Maryland. A stockpile of biological and chemical agents, including shellfish toxin, cobra venom, and other materials whose practical application in anything other than covert assassination was limited. The program had operated for years to develop tools for what the CIA documents describe as incapacitation and elimination of targets. When Nixon's 1969 order came down, requiring destruction of all biological weapons, the CIA determined internally, without public disclosure, without congressional authorization, and against the explicit directive of the executive order, that its stockpile fell outside the scope of the order because it was held for defensive research purposes. It kept approximately 11 grams of shellfish toxin and other materials. The stockpile was discovered only in 1975, when the Church Committee's investigations into CIA activities reached Fort Detrick. James Schlesinger, who had ordered the Family Jewels report, had not known about the stockpile. Congressional investigators found materials that had been retained in violation of a presidential directive for 6 years. The CIA's explanation was that the order had been ambiguous in its application to their specific holdings. The specific materials that could incapacitate or end a person, retained secretly in violation of a presidential order, were defended as a definitional question. A CIA officer named Sidney Gottlieb, who ran the program, had actually destroyed some records before they could be examined. The full accounting of MK Naomi's activities was never recovered. Story 3 while COINTELPRO, the FBI's documented program of surveilling, infiltrating, and disrupting left-wing political organizations, civil rights groups, and anti-war movements, has received significant historical attention. A related and less well-documented FBI initiative operated simultaneously and largely independently, the Ghetto Informant Program, which at its peak maintained thousands of paid informants specifically inside Black urban communities. The program was not focused on individuals suspected of specific criminal activity. It was focused on community sentiment. The informants, recruited from the ranks of barbers, shopkeepers, janitors, bartenders, and others whose occupations gave them wide social contact within their communities, were tasked specifically with reporting on expressions of radical sentiment, dissatisfaction with law enforcement, and sympathy toward organizations the FBI was monitoring. The program was designed to give the FBI early warning of potentially violent community sentiment and to identify community members who might be susceptible to recruitment by organizations the FBI considered threatening. It operated in cities with significant black populations across the United States and reported through regional field offices to FBI headquarters. The practical effect of a program of this scale and character is the one that all broad surveillance of this kind produces. It makes ordinary political expression, complaining about police, expressing sympathy for civil rights organizations, discussing economic inequality, a potential intelligence event. The community members who were the subjects of this surveillance were not accused of crimes. They were surveilled because of who they were and where they lived. The program is less famous than COINTELPRO because it was less dramatically disruptive. It simply watched, for years, at scale, in specific places, for reasons that were never disclosed to the communities being watched. Story 4 in 1956, the United States Army conducted a field test in Savannah, Georgia, and Avon Park, Florida, in which uninfected mosquitoes, specifically Aedes aegypti, a species capable of transmitting yellow fever and dengue fever, were released in large numbers over residential areas. The Army then measured how far the mosquitoes dispersed and how many residents they bit. The stated purpose was to assess the feasibility of using mosquitoes as a vector for biological warfare agents, to determine whether disease-carrying insects could be released over an enemy city in sufficient quantities to produce widespread infection among the civilian population. The uninfected mosquitoes were the test proxy. Could you get the mosquitoes to bite civilians broadly enough to be operationally useful? The residents of Savannah and Avon Park were not informed that they were part of a biological warfare feasibility study. They did not consent to being bitten by Army-released mosquitoes. Several residents of Avon Park reportedly became ill during the period of the tests, with symptoms consistent with dengue fever, though the Army's subsequent reporting attributed the illness to an unrelated natural mosquito population. The Army conducted follow-up tests in similar format under Operation Big Buzz and Operation Mayday, releasing larger numbers of mosquitoes over other test sites during the same period. The full scope of these tests, including the locations, dates, and any health outcomes in the affected civilian populations, was classified and remained unknown to those populations for decades. The tests were part of a broader biological warfare research program that, across its full documented scope, included aerial releases of simulant agents over dozens of American cities to test dispersal patterns under the premise that the agents used were harmless, a premise that was not always accurately evaluated. Story 5. Between approximately 1953 and 1965, the United States Army conducted a series of aerosol dispersal tests in American cities under a program called Operation LAC, in which chemical simulants were sprayed from rooftops, vehicles, and aircraft to study how airborne particles dispersed across urban environments. In St. Louis, Missouri, the tests involved spraying zinc cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent powder that could be tracked under ultraviolet light, from blowers mounted on vehicles and from the rooftops of buildings in residential neighborhoods. The stated purpose was to understand how a biological or chemical warfare agent would spread if deployed over an American city by an adversary. The specific geography of where the St. Louis tests were concentrated drew sustained criticism when the program was investigated decades later. The spray sites were disproportionately located in low-income black neighborhoods, including the Pruitt-Ego housing complex. Whether this represented deliberate targeting of populations the Army judged unlikely to notice or complain, a purely operational decision about the physical geography of the test sites, or a combination of both, has not been definitively established. The residents of these neighborhoods were not informed that the Army was conducting tests on them. They were not told what was being sprayed. They did not consent to participation. A 2012 investigation by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and subsequent congressional inquiries raised concerns about whether zinc-cadmium sulfide, which contains cadmium, a known carcinogen, was as harmless as Army testing materials were supposed to be, and whether elevated cancer rates in affected areas bore any relationship to the decades-old exposures. The Army maintained that the agent used was safe. Independent health researchers were divided. The Army did not tell anyone. For approximately 50 years, Story 6 Operation Popeye, the U.S. military made it rain over Vietnam for 5 years and nobody was told Operation Popeye, was a classified U.S. military program that ran from 1967 to 1972, during which aircraft flew cloud seeding missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. The specific objective was to extend the monsoon season by several weeks, increasing rainfall over the trail to the point where road surfaces became impassable for the trucks carrying supplies to North Vietnamese forces in the south. The program worked, in the limited sense that the cloud seeding operations produced measurable increases in rainfall in targeted areas. Whether this produced the specific operational outcomes the program sought, significant disruption to supply movements on the trail, is a more contested question, partly because the Ho Chi Minh Trail network was extensive, adaptive, and supported by enormous engineering effort to keep routes operational under adverse conditions. The program was kept secret from the American public and from most of Congress throughout its operation. The justification was operational security. Disclosing cloud seeding operations over Laos would have involved acknowledging other classified activities in the region. The program was exposed by journalist Seymour Hersh in 1972, based on a leaked government document. The Senate investigation that followed produced significant debate about whether weather modification as a weapon of war was permissible under international law, and what obligations the U.S. had to disclose such activities. The result was the 1977 Environmental Modification Convention, an international treaty banning hostile environmental modification as a weapon of war. The treaty exists specifically because this program existed. The international community's response to learning that a major power had secretly weaponized rainfall was to prohibit it internationally. The prohibition was written before most of the world's population knew that prohibition was needed. Story 7 The Moscow Signal, the Soviet embassy microwave, and the government that studied its employees instead of telling them in the early 1960s. American intelligence discovered that the Soviet Union had been beaming low-level microwave radiation at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. The beaming had apparently begun as early as 1953 and would continue in various forms until the late 1970s. The precise purpose of the microwave signal, intelligence gathering through activation of implanted listening devices, a direct health attack on embassy personnel, or some combination, was never definitively established. The U.S. government's response to this discovery is what makes it specifically disturbing rather than simply alarming. Rather than informing embassy staff that they were being exposed to microwave radiation of unknown biological effect, the government launched a classified research program, Project Pandora, to study the biological effects of microwave exposure. The research included studies of embassy personnel, conducted without their specific knowledge of what was being investigated and why. Embassy staff who were briefed on the signal at all were given incomplete information about its nature and the government's concerns about its health effects. For years, the ambassadors stationed in Moscow were not informed that their building was being irradiated. When some ambassadors did receive briefings, the health effect question was described as unresolved rather than as the subject of an active classified research program investigating whether their personnel had been harmed. Several ambassadors who served in Moscow during the exposure period subsequently developed cancer, including Ambassador Walter Stoessel, who developed a rare blood disease and died in 1986. Whether the microwave exposure contributed to these health outcomes was studied by the government in secret, and the results kept classified. The classified assessment concluded that the health risks were low. The assessment was not shared with the people whose health it addressed. Story 8: The Greenbrier Bunker. Congress had a nuclear shelter under a resort hotel for 30 years and nobody told the guests from 1958 to 1992. A full congressional relocation facility, complete with a House of Representatives chamber, a Senate chamber, a medical clinic, a broadcast studio, decontamination facilities, and enough supplies to shelter all 535 members of Congress, plus staff, for 60 days. Following a nuclear attack, sat operational and staffed beneath the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The facility was hidden beneath a convention wing of one of America's most prestigious resort hotels, accessed through blast doors disguised as ordinary hotel infrastructure. It was maintained continuously for 34 years by a crew of workers who lived cover lives as Greenbrier audio-visual employees. Congress members who used the resort for retreats and events walked above the bunker without being told it existed. The hotel's regular guests vacationed there for decades in complete ignorance of what was underground. The facility was built specifically because the hotel location was judged ideal, remote enough from major target cities to survive most nuclear exchanges, with infrastructure that could support a large facility, with a legitimate ongoing business providing natural cover for the regular deliveries and staff movements that maintaining the facility required. The existence of the Greenbrier Bunker was exposed in a 1992 Washington Post investigation by journalist Ted Gupp. Within weeks of the article's publication, the government determined that the facility's exposure meant it was no longer viable as a classified continuity site and closed it. 34 years of operational readiness. The facility was mothballed within months of becoming public knowledge. The Greenbrier now operates the bunker as a public tour attraction. The blast doors and the congressional chambers are shown to paying visitors. The decontamination showers are photographed by tourists who stay in the rooms above them. Story 9: Unit 731's immunity deal. The U.S. gave war criminals their freedom in exchange for data on killing people. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated in Manchuria during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, conducting some of the most extensively documented atrocities in the history of medical research. Prisoners, including Chinese civilians and POWs, as well as Soviet, Mongolian, Korean, and other prisoners, were subjected to vivisection, frostbite experiments, pressure experiments, disease infection, and weapons testing in ways that killed thousands of people. The immediate post-war question of what to do with the commanders and scientists of Unit 731 was resolved in a way that was kept secret from the American public and from the international community for decades. The United States granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to the senior leadership of Unit 731, including its commanding officer, Shir Ishii, in exchange for the data that their experiments had produced. The specific calculation, the biological warfare research data accumulated by Unit 731, represented years of human experimentation that could not be replicated under any ethical framework the United States could operate within. The U.S. government determined that the scientific value of the data exceeded the value of the war crimes prosecutions that the evidence would otherwise have supported. Ishii and the other senior Unit 731 figures were never prosecuted. They lived out their lives in Japan. The Soviet Union, which captured other Unit 731 personnel and did prosecute them, publicly criticized the American immunity deal. The U.S. denied it for decades. The extent of the immunity deal and its terms was not established in the public record until the late 1980s, when Japanese historians and subsequently American researchers documented it through archival research. The data obtained was shared across U.S. biological warfare research establishments throughout the Cold War. Story 10: Stasi Zersetzung. East Germany's secret police destroyed lives by rearranging furniture. The East German Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, developed and systematically applied a technique for dealing with dissidents and perceived political threats that was specifically designed to avoid producing martyrs. rather than arresting people and giving them the moral clarity of persecution. The Stasi practiced what it called Zerschätzung, literally corrosion or decomposition, a program of covert psychological disruption designed to destroy a target's life, relationships, and mental stability without their ever knowing that an organized campaign was responsible. The documented tactics were specific and deliberate. Stasi officers would enter a target's home while they were out, without leaving any evidence of entry, and make subtle, disorienting changes, rearranging books, moving objects slightly, leaving small signs that someone had been there that the target couldn't be certain of. They would spread carefully targeted rumors of infidelity or professional misconduct through the target's social circle, using agents who appeared to be the target's own friends. They would interfere with correspondence, causing letters to arrive damaged or not at all. They would coordinate with employers to create professional difficulties. They would arrange for small but recurring problems, mechanical failures, bureaucratic obstacles, canceled appointments that individually seemed like ordinary bad luck and collectively were anything but. The goal was to make the target doubt their own sanity, to destroy their personal relationships, to isolate them professionally, and to produce psychological collapse without the state's fingerprints on any of it. Many targets experienced the symptoms of severe mental illness without having mental illness. Several were subsequently committed to psychiatric facilities, having been driven to the point that their behavior appeared to warrant it. The Stasi files, opened after German reunification, allowed many former targets to read exactly what had been done to them and why. Story 11: The Doctor's Plot. Stalin fabricated a Jewish medical conspiracy and used torture to produce the confessions in January 1953. Soviet state media announced the exposure of a terrorist group of doctors, a conspiracy of prominent Soviet physicians, most of them Jewish, who were accused of having deliberately killed 2 senior Soviet officials through medical sabotage and of planning to, and other leaders. The announcement was the opening of what historians have analyzed as the likely beginning of a broad anti-Semitic political purge that may have been intended to culminate in the forced deportation of Soviet Jews. The accusations were fabricated. The confessions that documented them were produced through interrogation methods that the post-Stalin Soviet government subsequently acknowledged constituted torture. The physicians named in the plot had treated high-ranking Soviet officials for years. The accusation that they had been systematically poisoning rather than treating their patients was constructed to fit the confessions rather than the confessions constructed to fit the evidence. Stalin died in March 1953, approximately 6 weeks after the announcement. His successor, Lavrenti Beria, ordered the doctors released. The official Soviet announcement acknowledged that the confessions had been obtained through impermissible methods of investigation, the Soviet government's language for torture. The physicians were rehabilitated. The specific question that has occupied historians since is what the doctor's plot was intended to produce. The anti-Semitic character of the accusations, combined with the scale of arrests and the speed with which the official campaign was escalating before Stalin's death, has led many historians to conclude that a large-scale deportation of Soviet Jews was being prepared. Stalin's death prevented whatever conclusion the plot was building toward. The confessions were produced under torture. The accusations were invented. The people who fabricated them were, in some cases, subsequently rehabilitated and promoted. Story 12: The Petety Experiment. Communist Romania made prisoners torture each other into ideological compliance. The Petety prison experiment, conducted in Romania between 1949 and 1952, is one of the most extensively documented and most disturbing programs of institutional psychological destruction in the history of communist Europe, and one of the least well-known outside Romania, partly because the communist government that conducted it had strong reasons to suppress its documentation. The program, developed under the supervision of Alexandru Nicolshi of the Securitate, was based on the theory that political prisoners could be re-educated into genuine communist believers if the process of ideological conversion was sufficiently thorough. The method chosen to achieve this thoroughness was forcing prisoners to torture each other, The process was systematic and escalating. In the first phase, prisoner leaders selected by the administration tortured new arrivals physically and psychologically until they confessed to all connections to anti-communist organizations, including fabricated ones. In the second phase, the broken prisoner was then forced to participate in breaking others, to torture the new arrivals as they had been tortured. In the third phase, prisoners were forced to betray and denounce their closest relationships, producing confessions implicating family members and friends. The logic was specific. An individual who had tortured their fellow prisoners and betrayed their family could not maintain a coherent self-concept as a person of integrity opposing communist authority. But compliance was designed to be total because it was produced by acts the prisoner had committed themselves. The program was eventually shut down in 1952, apparently because the results were producing individuals too psychologically damaged to be useful, even to the state. Several of the student organizers of the original anti-communist groups were themselves broken through the process and then executed. Story 13, Operation West Ford. The U.S. military launched 480 million copper needles into space and called it science in 1961 and 1963. The United States Air Force launched 2 canisters into orbit, each containing approximately 240 million tiny copper dipole antennae, hair-thin needles about 1.7 centimeters long. The project, called West Ford, was intended to create an artificial ionosphere that could be used for military radio communications independent of the natural ionosphere, which solar activity could disrupt. The scientific community's response was immediate and alarmed. Astronomers, including those affiliated with the International Astronomical Union, formally protested that releasing almost 500 million metal fragments into orbit constituted a permanent contamination of near-Earth space that could interfere with astronomical observation and could, if the needles clumped rather than dispersing as intended, create a debris hazard for future space operations. The Soviet Union and the United Kingdom both filed formal diplomatic protests. The protests were noted, and the program proceeded anyway. The second launch, in 1963, was intended to correct problems with the first. The 1961 dispenser failed to release the needles as planned, creating a clump rather than the intended ring. The 1963 launch was more successful as an operational matter. The belt of needles was used for several test communications. The needles dispersed as intended over the following years. Some clumps from both launches are still in orbit. The communication technology that West Ford was designed to provide was superseded by communication satellites before the West Ford system was ever operationally deployed. The military communications application never materialized. The needles remain. West Ford is the specific episode that produced the international discussion about orbital debris that eventually led to guidelines, voluntary, not binding, about responsible behavior in orbit. Those guidelines arrived after the needles were already up there. Story 14, The Camera. The Soviet Union's secret poison laboratory tested lethal substances on Gulag prisoners. The Camera, the name means simply the chamber in Russian, was a covert Soviet poison laboratory that operated from at least the 1920s through the Cold War period, attached to the NKVD and subsequently to the MGB and KGB security services. Its operations were directed toward 2 goals: developing substances for use in assassinations and covert operations, and testing those substances on human subjects in conditions where the testing could not be attributed to the laboratory. The human subjects were Gulag prisoners. The testing was conducted under the supervision of toxicologist Grigory Myronovsky, who tested ricin, digitoxin, nitrogen mustard, cyanide, and other compounds on prisoners presented to him as subjects for medical experiments. Myronovsky's own account, provided in documents that became available after the Soviet Union's collapse, described the selection and testing process in clinical terms. He tested substances to establish dosage, time to effect, and detectability in post-mortem examination. The camera's operational output included substances used in documented KGB assassination operations. The assassination of Ukrainian nationalist Lev Rebet in 1957 and Stepan Bandera in 1959, both killed using a prussic acid spray device, were attributed to a KGB officer named Bogdan Stashinsky, who subsequently defected to West Germany and described his operations. The weapon used was almost certainly a product of camera research. Myronovsky was eventually arrested in 1951 during a period of internal KGB reorganization, convicted of crimes related to his work, and sent to a labor camp, not for the human experimentation, which was sanctioned, but for separate crimes of excess. He was released after Stalin's death and died in 1974. The camera itself continued operating after his arrest under different personnel. Story 15, Colonia Dignidad. A sealed German colony in Chile became a torture site for Pinochet's secret police. Colonia Dignidad was a settlement of German emigrants established in rural Chile in 1961, led by Paul Schfer, a former German youth group leader who had fled Germany facing allegations of abuse. The colony was physically isolated, surrounded by fencing and electronic sensors, and its residents were subject to strict internal control, including restricted communication with the outside world. Following the 1973 military coup that brought General Augusto Pinochet to power in Chile, Colonia Dignidad developed a relationship with the Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, Pinochet's secret police. The colony's isolation and physical security made it useful as a detention site for political prisoners who were brought there and tortured, in some cases killed and buried on the colony's grounds, by DINA personnel. The collaboration was kept secret through a combination of the colony's physical inaccessibility, the DINA's operational security, and the Pinochet government's relationship with the colony's leadership, which benefited from the protection that the association with state security provided. Former prisoners who survived gave accounts of being held and tortured at the colony. Investigations after the return of democracy in Chile exhumed remains from the property. Paul Schfer, who had used the colony's internal authority to commit decades of abuse against both German Chilean children in the colony and Chilean children brought from outside, was eventually extradited to Chile, convicted of abuse and complicity in the political crimes of the Pinochet era, and died in a Chilean prison in 2010. The specific combination, a sealed religious community, a military dictatorship, and a torture site, existed in plain sight in rural Chile for over 2 decades. Story 16, The Bulgarian Umbrella. An assassin killed a dissident on a London bridge with a pellet fired from an umbrella on September 7, 1978. Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian writer and dissident who had defected to the West and was broadcasting for the BBC World Service and Radio Free Europe, was standing at a bus stop on Waterloo Bridge in London when he felt a sharp sting on the back of his right thigh. He turned to see a man picking up an umbrella who apologized and hailed a taxi. Markov died 4 days later. The post-mortem examination found a tiny pellet, 1,052 millimeters in diameter, embedded in his leg. The pellet had been engineered with 2 tiny holes drilled into it, and traces of a biological substance were identified in the cavity. Forensic and scientific analysis subsequently established that the substance was ricin, a toxin derived from castor beans for which there is no antidote. The umbrella had been modified to fire the pellet using a mechanism that disguised the firing action as the ordinary pressure of an umbrella tip on the ground. The pellet had a wax coating designed to melt at body temperature, releasing the ricin. The investigation into Markov's assassination implicated the Bulgarian Secret Service with probable KGB technical assistance. The sophistication of the weapon, the specific engineering of the pellet, the delivery mechanism, the biological agent selected, indicated the resources and technical capability of a major intelligence service rather than an individual or small group. The primary suspect in the actual delivery was identified by investigators decades later, but died before he could be formally charged. The Bulgarian government has acknowledged that the Državna Sigurnost was responsible. The specific operational details, who authorized the assassination, who provided the technical capability, remain partially unresolved in the public record. Story 17, Operation Infection. The KGB planted a story that the US created AIDS, and it took decades to fully counter in 1983. An East German communist newspaper called the Tagespost published a letter from an American biologist named Jacob Siegel, claiming that AIDS had been developed by the United States military at Fort Detrick, Maryland, as a biological weapon, and had been released deliberately or accidentally through human experimentation. The claim was false. The letter was a KGB disinformation operation. The specific mechanism of the disinformation campaign, which the KGB called Operation Infection, and which has been extensively documented through Soviet archives available after the Cold War, was to plant the story in a way that made it appear to emerge organically from multiple independent sources. The initial Tagespost publication was followed by pickup in Soviet and Soviet-aligned media, then by selective amplification in Western alternative press outlets, then by distribution through diplomatic channels to developing world newspapers with large circulation. The story was designed to accumulate apparent credibility through the apparent independence of its multiple sources, all of which traced back to the same origin. By the late 1980s, polling in several countries showed that significant percentages of their populations believed or were uncertain about whether AIDS was a U.S. military creation. The disinformation had achieved a level of penetration that subsequent corrections from U.S. officials, mainstream scientific consensus, and eventually a Soviet acknowledgement that the story was fabricated did not fully reverse. Studies of conspiracy belief persistence consistently find that corrections are less effective than initial false claims, particularly when corrections arrive in the same or similar channels as the original disinformation. The AIDS disinformation campaign is the documented historical record case study for this finding. Versions of the claim continue to circulate. Story 18, the Rongelap resettlement. Marshall Islanders were sent back to a contaminated island to be studied the Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test on March 1, 1954. At Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands was the largest U.S. nuclear test ever conducted, producing a yield approximately 2.5 times larger than its designers had predicted. The miscalculation meant that radioactive fallout was distributed across a much wider area than the pre-test safety planning had accounted for, exposing the inhabitants of Rongelap Atoll, approximately 100 miles from the test site, to significant radiation without warning or evacuation. The Rongelap Islanders were evacuated to another atoll 3 days after the test, after suffering symptoms including nausea, skin lesions, and hair loss characteristic of significant radiation exposure. A 3-day delay in beginning the evacuation has been the subject of specific criticism from the affected population. 3 years later, in 1957, the U.S. government determined that Rongelap was safe for resettlement and moved the islanders back to their home atoll. In doing so, the government was aware, from ongoing scientific monitoring of contamination levels, that the atoll was not entirely clean and that the returning population would continue to be exposed to residual contamination. The Atomic Energy Commission's own scientists documented the contamination levels and the expected continued exposure. The population was resettled and monitored. The Marshallese were subjects of an ongoing radiological health study, Project 4.1, which EC documents describe as a study of the response of human beings exposed to significant beta and gamma radiation due to fallout from a high-yield thermonuclear detonation that required an exposed population to study. The islanders requested evacuation again in 1985, citing continued health concerns. Greenpeace eventually transported them in 1985 after U.S. authorities declined to act. The specific decision-making behind the 1957 resettlement has been the subject of congressional inquiry and formal claims by the Marshallese government. Story 19, the Rainbow Warrior bombing. French intelligence sank a Greenpeace ship, killed a man, and then lied about it, the Rainbow Warrior was a Greenpeace vessel that in July 1985 was moored in Auckland Harbour, New Zealand, preparing to lead a flotilla of protest vessels to French Polynesia to demonstrate against French nuclear testing at Mururoa Atoll. On the night of July 10, 2 bombs attached to the hull of the ship exploded in sequence. The ship sank. A Portuguese-Dutch photographer named Fernando Pereira, who had gone below decks to retrieve camera equipment, was killed. Within days, New Zealand police had arrested 2 French nationals carrying Swiss passports. The investigation established that they were agents of the French Directorate General for External Security, the DIX, France's Foreign Intelligence Service. Further investigation identified them as members of a French Special Forces diving team that had been specifically deployed to destroy the Rainbow Warrior. The French government's initial response was denial. French Defense Minister Charles Hernu stated that France had nothing to do with the attack. The denials continued for weeks as the New Zealand investigation accumulated evidence that the operation had been authorized at senior levels of the French government. Eventually, under significant diplomatic and journalistic pressure, France acknowledged the operation. Hernu resigned. The 2 agents who had been captured, Major Alain Maffart and Captain Dominique Prieur, were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in New Zealand, then transferred to French custody under a bilateral agreement and were released within 2 years. France paid New Zealand a settlement and separately paid a settlement to Greenpeace. The family of Fernando Pereira received a settlement. The French agents who carried out the bombing were given medals by the French government after their release. Story 20: The Wilson Plot. British intelligence may have run a covert campaign to destabilize its own prime minister. The allegation is specific. The source is credible, and the UK government has never fully resolved it. In the 1970s, elements within the British Security Service, MI5, conducted a covert operation designed to destabilize and discredit Prime Minister Harold Wilson, whom they suspected of being, or of having been compromised by, Soviet intelligence. The primary source is Peter Wright, a former MI5 assistant director, whose memoir Spycatcher, published in 1987, described an organized effort by a group of MI5 officers to undermine Wilson's government. Wright claimed that officers had planned to leak damaging material to the press, had conducted unauthorized investigations of Wilson's associates, and had discussed scenarios for removing Wilson from office. Wright described being part of these discussions himself. The UK government attempted to ban Spycatcher, pursuing legal action across multiple jurisdictions, including Australia, where the publisher was based. The attempted suppression generated significantly more attention for the book's claims than a quiet non-response would have. The UK lost its court battles in most jurisdictions. The book was published. The government's position was that the claims were false or exaggerated. Harold Wilson himself, before his death in 1995, told journalists that he believed MI5 had run a dirty tricks campaign against him during his terms as Prime Minister. He described believing that his office at 10 Downing Street had been bugged by British intelligence. The specific evidence for or against the Wilson plot at the level of formal documentation has never been publicly established. The Spycatcher allegations have been taken seriously by historians who study British intelligence and seriously disputed by others. The UK government has never commissioned or published a formal inquiry into the specific claims. Story 21: The unfortunate experiment. New Zealand doctors withheld cancer treatment for 20 years to study what would happen. Between approximately 1966 and 1987, Professor Herbert Green at National Women's Hospital in Auckland, New Zealand, conducted what he described as a study of the natural progression of carcinoma in situ of the cervix, a precancerous condition of the cervical cells that, left untreated, progresses to invasive cervical cancer in a significant proportion of cases. Green's hypothesis was that carcinoma in situ was largely benign and did not reliably progress to invasive cancer, a view that was inconsistent with the existing medical evidence, but that Green held with conviction. To test this hypothesis, he enrolled women diagnosed with the condition in an observation protocol. he watched the progression of their condition without treating it. The women were not informed that they had a precancerous condition. They were not told that treatment was available. They were not told that their conditions were being observed rather than managed. A 1987 inquiry led by Judge Sylvia Cartwright, commissioned after a journalist named Sandra Coney and researcher Phillida Bunkle exposed the program, documented that over the 2 decades of the study, women who could have received effective treatment had instead been observed as their conditions progressed. Some developed invasive cervical cancer that could have been prevented. Several died. The Cartwright Inquiry's report used the term unfortunate experiment in characterizing Green's work. The report found that the study had been conducted unethically, that the women had not given informed consent to participation in research, and that the hospital administration had known about Green's work and had not intervened. The inquiry's findings led directly to New Zealand's development of formal health research ethics codes and patient rights frameworks. The Women's Health Action Group, formed by the women who had been subjects of the study, remained active in health advocacy for decades after the inquiry. Story 22, Operation Argus. The U.S. secretly detonated nuclear bombs in space without telling Congress, or the public in August and September of 1958. The United States conducted 3 nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere over the South Atlantic Ocean, at altitudes ranging from approximately 100 to 500 miles above the Earth's surface. The tests were conducted in secret, with a minimal congressional briefing that fell far short of the notification that the scale of the program would normally require, and with no public disclosure. Project Argus, as it was called, was designed to test a theory proposed by physicist Nicholas Christophilos that nuclear detonations at altitude would inject high-energy electrons into the Earth's magnetic field lines, creating artificial radiation belts that could disrupt radio communications and potentially fuse the electronics of ballistic missile warheads passing through them. It was, in concept, a missile defense system delivered by exploding nuclear weapons in space. The operation involved a naval task force of 10 ships in the South Atlantic. The 3 detonations were in the megaton range. The artificial radiation belts created were detected by Explorer 4 and other satellites and were measurable for weeks. The program was exposed by a New York Times journalist in 1959. The scientific community's response included concern about the detonation's potential effects on the ionosphere and natural radiation belts, and whether the Christophilos effect had been fully characterized before the tests were conducted. The Atmospheric Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, was the eventual regulatory response to a period of nuclear testing that included Argus and programs like it. The treaty was signed 5 years after the Argus tests. The Argus detonations are still occasionally cited as the first human activity to create detectable, lasting modifications to the near-space environment. Story 23, Vozdrozhdeniya Island. The Soviet bioweapons test site slowly rising from a shrinking sea, Vozdrozhdeniya Island, Resurrection Island, sits in what was once the middle of the Aral Sea, the inland sea in Central Asia that Soviet irrigation projects drained to near elimination in the second half of the 20th century. When it was surrounded by water, the island's remote location made it ideal for a specific use. It served as the primary outdoor testing site for Soviet biological weapons. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the island hosted live testing of weaponized anthrax, plague, smallpox, and other agents on animals, including monkeys, horses, and sheep. The testing was conducted by facilities affiliated with Biopreparat, the massive Soviet civilian military biological weapons program that operated in secret in direct violation of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention that the Soviet Union had signed. In 1988, as the Soviet Union prepared to abandon the island, personnel conducted a decontamination operation that buried large quantities of anthrax spores in metal containers at several locations on the island. The burial was intended to permanently contain the material. Whether the containers remained sealed and whether the decontamination was adequate has been a subject of ongoing concern. As the Aral Sea has continued to shrink through the 1990s and 2000s, Vozrozhdeniya is no longer an island. It has been connected to the mainland since approximately 2001. The anthrax burial sites are now accessible by land. The containers are aging. A 2002 U.S.-Uzbekistan program treated the burial sites with chlorine bleach to end any remaining viable anthrax spores. Scientists involved reported that viable spores were found at the sites. Whether the treatment was complete is not publicly confirmed. The island, that used to be surrounded by water, where the Soviet Union tested biological weapons, is now connected to Central Asia by dry land. Story 24. In the spring of 1940, Soviet NKVD forces executed approximately 22,000 Polish nationals, officers, police, members of the intelligentsia, doctors, lawyers, landowners, and others, in a series of mass killings at Katyn Forest, near Smolensk, and at other sites. The killings were authorized by Stalin and the Politburo, carried out systematically over several weeks, and then buried in mass graves. When German forces discovered the Katyn graves in 1943, Germany broadcast the finding internationally as evidence of Soviet barbarism. The Soviet response was to deny responsibility and attribute the massacre to the Germans, to claim that the Polish officers had been killed by German forces after the Soviet Union was invaded in 1941. The Soviet attribution was a lie that the Soviet government maintained as official policy for almost 50 years. The Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal declined to include Katyn in the charges against the German defendants, specifically because the evidence did not support the Soviet accusation, and several countries' governments privately understood that the massacre was Soviet in origin. The lie was diplomatically convenient enough that it was not challenged publicly by Western governments during the Cold War. The Polish government in exile, the families of the murdered, and Polish historians maintain that the Soviet explanation was false throughout the Cold War period. The Soviet government continued to maintain the German attribution officially. In 1990, under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union officially acknowledged responsibility for the Katyn massacre. The Polish government received documents showing the NKVD's direct responsibility. The 1943 documents showing the Politburo's authorization were released. 50 years of a lie, maintained at the highest levels of a state, defending a crime that was documented from the moment it was committed. Story 25. The Military Reaction Force. A secret British Army unit was accused of shooting civilians in Belfast. The Military Reaction Force was a small, plainclothes British Army unit that operated in Belfast during the early 1970s, at the height of the Troubles, in a covert capacity whose full extent was not publicly acknowledged until decades after its operations. Former members of the unit, including Captain Fred Holroyd and subsequently Captain Colin Wallace, made allegations about the unit's activities that the British government declined to confirm or investigate adequately for many years. The allegations, made by former members in various forms over subsequent decades, included claims that members of the unit had shot civilians in circumstances that did not meet the legal requirements for the use of lethal force, killings that were not classified as security force operations, and for which no accountability was sought or established. The specific institutional sensitivity of the Misrif allegations is their context within a broader pattern of unresolved killings in Northern Ireland during the Troubles period, in which families of people killed by security forces have sought official accountability and documentation that the British government has been slow to provide. A 2013 BBC Panorama investigation brought renewed attention to the MISTF, including testimony from former unit members acknowledging that the unit had shot at individuals who may not have been combatants. The SNI subsequently opened investigations into specific killings attributed to the unit. The unit's existence was not confirmed in any public document until decades after its operations had ended. The specific legal authority under which it operated, the full scope of its activities, and the accountability structure that governed its use of lethal force have never been fully established in the public record. Story 26. Chile's Caravan of Death. a military death squad traveled by helicopter to execute political prisoners in October 1973, approximately 1 month after the military coup that brought Augusto Pinochet to power in Chile. An army officer named Sergio Arellano Stark traveled by helicopter with a delegation of military officers to regional military facilities across Chile. At each facility, the delegation reviewed lists of political prisoners being held there, selected specific individuals, and had them removed and killed. The operation, which subsequently became known as the Caravan of Death, covered facilities in Rancagua, Curic, Talca, Concepción, Los Angeles, Cauquenes, La Serena, Copiap, Antofagasta, and Calama over approximately 2 weeks. At each location, prisoners who had been captured in the aftermath of the coup were taken from the facility and executed, in some cases by methods more violent than a simple execution. The systematic, coordinated character of the Caravan of Death, the helicopter itinerary, the delegation of military officers, the pattern of reviewing prisoner lists and selecting victims at each facility established that it was not a series of isolated local decisions, but an organized operation. The question of who authorized it and what its specific purpose was has been central to subsequent judicial proceedings. In 2000, a Chilean court indicted Arellano Stark for the killings. Pinochet, who eventually faced charges related to the broader human rights abuses of his regime, died in 2006 before his trials were concluded. The relatives of the caravan's victims have pursued accountability through Chilean courts for decades. The operation's specific quality, the documented helicopter itinerary, the selection lists, the systematic movement from facility to facility, left a documentary record that subsequent investigations have been able to reconstruct with unusual specificity. Story 27, Operation Cauldron. Britain tested anthrax and plague weapons off its own coastline on live animals between 1952 and 1955. The British Ministry of Defence conducted a series of open-air biological weapons trials off the Scottish coast, including in the Outer Hebrides and in waters near Stornoway and Lewis. The trials, conducted from ships and aircraft, involved the dispersal of weaponized biological agents, including anthrax and plague, over cages of live animals, primarily monkeys and guinea pigs, to test the weapon's effectiveness and dispersal characteristics. The trials were conducted in conditions of strict secrecy. They took place in waters adjacent to inhabited coastline. The research was part of the British Biological Weapons Program that also produced the contamination of Gruinard Island, an island off the Scottish coast used for wartime anthrax bomb testing that was declared uninhabitable and closed to public access from 1942 until 1990. The specific concern that subsequent analysis of the Operation Cauldron trials raised was the adequacy of the containment assumptions underlying the tests. The tests were conducted in open water, in coastal locations where currents and wind could carry biological agents toward the mainland. The animals used in the tests were on ships and in cages that were subsequently sunk or destroyed, but the dispersal of agents during the tests themselves was controlled only by the weather conditions of the test days. The Ministry of Defense's full accounting of what agents were tested, in what quantities, in what locations, and with what monitoring of dispersal was not made publicly available until researchers sought the records through official channels decades later. Whether any agent from the trials reached inhabited areas is not established in the public record. The trials produced scientific data on biological weapon effectiveness. They produced it in the waters around Britain. Story 28, the East German Forced Adoption Program. The Stasi gave the children of dissidents to loyal families among the Stasi's documented methods for dealing with citizens who attempted to leave East Germany without authorization or who engaged in politically unacceptable behavior was one that operated outside the normal framework of criminal punishment. The children of those deemed politically unreliable were, in documented cases, removed from parental custody and given to foster or adoptive families considered loyal to the state. The program specifically targeted parents who had been imprisoned for attempting to cross the border, Republikflucht, the crime of attempting to flee the Republic, and others who had come to the attention of the state security apparatus for political reasons. Children who were removed were placed in state care facilities or with families, sometimes with their identities partially obscured to reduce the likelihood of biological parents locating them. The program was not acknowledged officially during the communist period. It became known through a combination of Stasi files opened after German reunification and the accounts of individuals who discovered in adulthood that they had been adopted without their biological parents' consent, after their parents had been imprisoned for political offenses. The scope of the program has been difficult to establish precisely because the records were not compiled in a single administrative category. The removals occurred through the normal child welfare bureaucracy, which was used as the mechanism, making systematic accounting difficult. Estimates of the number of children affected have varied widely among researchers. The reunification of families separated by the program and the specific question of legal accountability for those who administered it remained active concerns in Germany decades after the Stasi's dissolution. Story 29 Project Shad. The U.S. military tested biological agents on Navy sailors without telling them, Project 112, and its associated naval component, Project Shad, were Cold War-era U.S. military programs that conducted tests of chemical and biological agents' effects on military equipment and personnel. The tests, conducted primarily in the 1960s and early 1970s, involved spraying chemical and biological simulants, agents intended to mimic the dispersal characteristics of actual warfare agents, over Navy ships at sea, and measuring the results. In some SHAD tests, actual chemical warfare agents were used rather than simulants. In some tests, the agents used were later reclassified from simulant to harmful. The sailors aboard the ships that served as test platforms were not informed that they were participating in biological or chemical warfare tests. The program remained classified until a 2000 Vanity Fair article brought public attention to it, prompting a Department of Defense investigation. The investigation identified 46 specific test events between 1962 and 1973, involving a total of approximately 6,000 military personnel. The investigation found that the health of veterans who had participated in these tests had not been adequately monitored for subsequent conditions that might be related to exposure. Veterans who had served aboard the test ships reported difficulty obtaining VA health benefits related to conditions they attributed to their exposure, partly because the classified nature of the program had made documentation of their participation difficult to obtain, and partly because the specific agents used in the tests they had participated in were not fully disclosed for years. Congress required the Department of Defense to notify veterans of their participation in Project 112/SHAD and to provide medical monitoring for affected individuals. The full accounting of agents used in specific test events and the health outcomes associated with those tests remains incompletely documented. Story 30 Operation Shocker. An FBI informant ran inside a domestic political movement for 20 years. Operation Shocker, the FBI's code name for one of the longest-running confirmed deep-cover domestic infiltration operations in American history, involved a single informant who operated inside a domestic political organization from 1959 to approximately 1980, a span of over 2 decades during which the informant attended meetings, built relationships, rose in the organization's trust, and reported regularly to FBI handlers. The operation's existence and basic parameters became known through FOIA requests and the FBI's own records that became available as part of broader investigations into COINTELPRO and related programs. The specific informant, the specific organization, and the specific content of the reporting remain partially redacted in available documents, reflecting ongoing classification concerns about informant identity and associated intelligence equities. What the Shocker records confirm is the operational model: a single individual, cultivated and managed by the FBI, embedded deeply enough in a domestic organization over a long enough period that their access to the organization's internal discussions, planning, and membership information was comprehensive rather than peripheral. The FBI's investment in the operation, handler time, administrative support, payments over 2 decades, reflects the intelligence value placed on this type of deep access. The COINTELPRO-era FBI ran infiltration operations across a range of domestic political organizations, from civil rights groups to student movements to socialist and communist organizations, as well as far-right groups. Operation Shocker is notable specifically for its duration, 20 years of continuous operation, rather than for any specific incident associated with it. An informant who attends meetings and reports for 20 years is attending the meetings and reporting throughout periods when the organization does things that the FBI considers significant. What those things were is in the redacted portions. Story 31, the Presidential Emergency Facilities Network. Hundreds of secret bunkers were built across America and put on no public map beyond the well-known continuity of government facilities: Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, the Greenbrier. The United States government constructed, through the Cold War period, a much larger network of smaller, dispersed emergency relocation facilities intended to preserve government function in the event of nuclear attack. These facilities were distributed across the country, built into existing infrastructure or constructed as standalone installations, and maintained without public disclosure or any appearance on public property records. The network's existence has been established through a combination of investigative journalism, property record research, and declassified records, rather than through any comprehensive official disclosure. The scope of the network, its total number of facilities, their locations, their current operational status, and what function each was intended to serve, has never been fully publicly documented. What research has established is that the federal government's continuity infrastructure extended well beyond the hardened bunkers designed to shelter the senior executive branch and legislative leadership. Regional emergency relocation facilities existed to shelter federal agency personnel and to maintain essential government services, communications, financial system administration, law enforcement coordination. Following a nuclear exchange, many of these facilities were built using normal federal construction contracting channels, but with classification applied to the specific purpose of the construction, meaning that contractors built specific types of hardened rooms and installed specific communications equipment under contracts that did not describe what the overall facility was for. The property records research that has identified some of these facilities typically locates them through the combination of hardened construction specifications, specific communications infrastructure, and federal property ownership, none of which individually indicates a purpose, but which together form a recognizable pattern. Story 32, Project Bluebird. The CIA asked whether hypnosis could make someone end without knowing it. Project Bluebird was the CIA's first formally organized program investigating the possibility of controlling human behavior through psychological and chemical means. Established in 1950 and subsequently renamed Project Artichoke in 1951. The specific questions it was designed to answer were precise and operational. Could a person be hypnotized to perform acts they would refuse in a fully conscious state? Could memories of an operation be selectively erased? Could a defector be made to appear more or less credible than they actually were through hypnotic suggestion? Could a person be conditioned to carry out an act on command and have no memory of doing so? The operational scenario that drove these questions was what the CIA's own documents describe as the Manchurian Candidate concept, the possibility of an individual who could be programmed to carry out an assassination or other covert act and would be unable to disclose either their handlers or their instructions because their memory of both would have been suppressed. The hypnosis research within Bluebird produced specific, documented experimental sessions conducted on subjects including prisoners, mental patients, and in some cases individuals who appear in the records simply as sources without further identification. The experiments tested whether hypnotic instruction could override conscious refusal, whether post-hypnotic amnesia could be reliably induced and maintained, and whether the combination of hypnosis and pharmaceutical agents could produce more complete compliance than either alone. The documents from Bluebird that are available in the public record, partial because many were destroyed in 1973, do not provide a definitive answer to whether the Manchurian Candidate scenario was achieved. They do show that the CIA invested substantial resources in pursuing it over a period that extended from Bluebird through Artichoke and into MKUltra's broader research program for approximately 2 decades. Story 33, the Noborito Institute. Imperial Japan had a second secret weapons lab that the West has barely documented. Unit 731 is the Japanese military biological warfare program that has received the most historical attention, both because of the scale of its atrocities and because the post-war immunity deal with the United States brought it into American official consciousness. Less well documented in Western historical literature is the Noborito Research Institute, also known as Noborito Laboratory, or the 9th Technical Research Institute of the Imperial Japanese Army, which operated from the late 1930s through 1945 in a facility near Tokyo. Where Unit 731 focused primarily on biological agents, Noborito's research mandate was broader. It developed techniques for economic sabotage, including high-quality counterfeiting of foreign currencies, particularly Chinese yuan and American dollars, intended to destabilize enemy economies. It developed specialized assassination weapons, including poison delivery systems. It developed incendiary devices, including the Fugo balloon bomb program, paper hydrogen balloons, carrying incendiary and anti-personnel payloads that were launched across the Pacific to start fires in the US and Canada. The Fugo program, which launched approximately 9,000 balloons from 1944 to 1945, is the one component of Noborito's work that has received significant Western attention, primarily because 6 Americans, members of a church group in Oregon, were killed by a Fugo bomb in 1945, the only direct deaths from enemy action in the continental United States during the war. The deaths were censored by the U.S. government to prevent Japan from obtaining feedback about the balloon's reach. The full scope of Noborito's research, particularly its work on assassination methods and economic sabotage technologies, has been incompletely documented in available records, partly because the Japanese military destroyed significant documentation before the war's end, and partly because post-war Allied investigations prioritized biological weapons research over economic and assassination warfare. Story 34, Operation Whitecoat. Conscientious objectors were used as biodefense test subjects for 20 years between 1954 and 1973. The United States Army conducted a biodefense research program at Fort Detrick, Maryland, using human volunteers drawn specifically from the Seventh-day Adventist faith community. The program, known as Operation Whitecoat, enrolled approximately 300 volunteer soldiers who had registered as conscientious objectors and who chose to serve as medical research subjects rather than in combat roles. The volunteers were exposed to biological agents, including Q fever, tularemia, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, sandfly fever, and Rift Valley fever, as part of research designed to develop treatments and protective vaccines for diseases that might be used in biological warfare. The stated rationale was that research on human subjects was necessary to develop adequate medical countermeasures, and that using volunteers from a faith community with specific ethical convictions about the value of human service provided a population whose consent was genuine and whose cooperation was motivated by clearly understood religious values. The ethical dimensions of the program are complex. The volunteers gave informed consent in a general sense. They knew they would be exposed to biological agents as part of medical research. Whether they were fully informed of all the agents they would be exposed to, all the potential long-term health consequences, and the specific military context of the research, the relationship between their exposure and the Army's broader biological warfare program is a question that researchers who have studied Whitecoat have not been able to resolve conclusively from available documentation. Several former White Coat participants developed chronic health conditions and have sought VA benefits related to their exposures. The Army's long-term health monitoring of the participant population was discontinued before the program's full health outcomes could be established. Story 35: Portugal's Pied Colonial Operations, a secret police force that history mostly forgot to document the Pied. Polícia Internacional e de Defesa do Estado, Portugal's secret police under the Estado Novo dictatorship, is reasonably well documented in its domestic operations against Portuguese political dissidents through the Carnation Revolution of 1974 that ended the regime. Far less documented in Western sources and in much of the available historical record are the Pied's operations in Portugal's African colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe, where it ran parallel surveillance, infiltration, and coercive interrogation operations against independence movements from the late 1950s through the early 1970s. The colonial Pied operations occurred against the backdrop of wars of independence in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, in which Portuguese security forces, including Pied, operated against independence movements that were receiving support from various Cold War actors. The Pied's colonial activities included infiltration of independence organizations, interrogation of captured suspects, and operations whose specific details were not well documented even in the Portuguese archives that became accessible after 1974. Part of the reason for the relative absence of documentation is that the Pied destroyed significant records before the Carnation Revolution. Part is that the historical attention to Cold War-era political repression has concentrated on the large state security services of the Communist bloc and the Latin American dictatorships, where the documentary record was more extensive and where the political stakes of documentation were higher. The individuals who experienced Pied operations in colonial Africa and the communities affected by those operations have had limited access to historical processes that would establish the record in the way that post-communist societies have approached their secret police histories.